They say every empire has a price, and I learned early that the American empire was no different. My name carries weight on both sides of the border, spoken in whispers in the mountains of Jalisco and in the conference rooms of federal buildings across the United States. I am Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, though the world knows me as El Mencho, and this is a story they never wanted you to hear. This is about how I bought the very people sworn to bring me down, how I turned Atlanta into my eastern stronghold, and how the incorruptible became my most valuable assets. People think the drug war is fought with bullets and cocaine. They're wrong. It's fought with bank accounts, compromised morals, and the understanding that every man has a breaking point. I found that breaking point in the heart of Georgia, and what I discovered changed everything. The hunters became the hunted, and the hunters became mine. I didn't start at the top. Nobody does in this life. I was born in poverty, Michoacán, worked as a police officer in my youth, and saw firsthand how the system operated. The badge meant nothing when your family was starving. The oath meant nothing when cartel money could feed your children for a generation. I learned that lesson young, and I never forgot it. When I joined the drug trade, I wasn't some ambitious narco looking for glory. I was a strategist who understood that the real war wasn't in the streets or the mountains. It was in the institutions, in the government offices, in the task forces that pretended to be untouchable. By the time I took control of what would become the CJNG in 2010, I had already spent years studying the American law enforcement system. I knew their budgets, their promotion structures, their internal politics, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Atlanta wasn't random. Everything I do has a purpose, a calculation. By 2015, the CJNG had established dominance in Mexico, but the real money, the real power, lay in the American market. The East Coast was underdeveloped compared to the West, and Atlanta sat at the perfect crossroads. The city was growing, diverse, with international airports and highways connecting every major eastern city. More importantly, it housed a joint DEA-FBI task force specifically targeting Mexican cartels. Most would see that as a problem. I saw it as an opportunity. If I could compromise that task force, I wouldn't just have a distribution hub. I would have eyes and ears inside the very organization hunting me. I would know about operations before they happened, about informants before they could talk, about investigations before they could build cases. The question wasn't if I could buy them. The question was how much it would cost. The approach had to be subtle, layered, impossible to trace back to me directly. I never met any American agent personally. That's not how sophisticated operations work. Instead, I used intermediaries, businessmen with legitimate fronts, lawyers who specialized in gray areas, and most effectively, family members of targets who were already compromised by debt, addiction, or scandal. My intelligence network identified 3 specific agents in the Atlanta task force who showed vulnerability. One had a gambling problem that had cost him his marriage and left him drowning in debt to some very unpleasant people in Miami. Another was having an affair with a confidential informant and feared the relationship would destroy his career if discovered. The third was simply greedy, resentful of years of dangerous work for government pay while watching drug dealers live in mansions. 3 different weaknesses, 3 different approaches, but one common thread: they all believed they were too smart to get caught. The first contact happened in 2016, not in some dark alley, but in a golf club outside Buckhead. My intermediary was a Mexican businessman who owned several legitimate logistics companies that moved products across the border. He had no criminal record, paid his taxes, donated to politicians, and had a reputation above reproach. He befriended the gambling addict at a charity event, played golf with him twice, and casually mentioned he knew people who could help with financial problems. No drug talk, no cartel mentions, just a wealthy friend offering assistance. The agent was desperate enough to listen. Within 2 months, his gambling debts were cleared through an offshore account that appeared to come from a personal loan company in the Cayman Islands. The paperwork was perfect, legal on the surface, but the message was clear. Someone with resources was now invested in his continued well-being. He didn't have to do anything immediately. The debt itself was the hook. We just had to wait for him to realize he was already caught. The second agent required a different approach because his weakness was more emotional than financial. His affair with the confidential informant was genuinely romantic, not just physical, which made him vulnerable in a different way. My people identified her as someone we had leverage over. She had family in Guadalajara, cousins who had borrowed money from local operators connected to our network. A quiet conversation with her, explaining that her family's debt could disappear and her boyfriend's career could be protected, or everything could be exposed, gave us another access point. She didn't want to betray him, but she loved him enough to protect him from the consequences. She began sharing small details about operations, never suspecting that her pillow talk was being compiled into intelligence reports. The agent never knew his lover was compromised, and that made the information even more valuable. He trusted her completely, which meant he told her everything. The third agent was the simplest because his motivation was pure greed. He didn't need elaborate schemes or emotional manipulation. He needed an opportunity that felt like it came from his own cleverness. My intermediaries arranged for him to encounter a money laundering operation that appeared poorly concealed, money moving through car dealerships and check cashing businesses in amounts just large enough to be tempting but small enough to seem manageable. When he discovered it during routine surveillance, he saw an opportunity to skim. Instead of reporting the full amount seized in operations, he began pocketing percentages, convinced he was stealing from criminals who couldn't report the theft. What he didn't know was that every dollar he took was carefully tracked, photographed, and documented. We let him steal for 8 months, building an evidence file that would destroy him completely. Once we had enough, the leverage was simple. Work for us or go to prison and watch your family lose everything. By mid-2017, I had 3 sources inside the Atlanta task force, none of whom knew about the others. The gambling addict provided information about upcoming operations and warrant applications. The agent with the compromised girlfriend gave us details about informant identities and witness protection placements. The greedy one, now fully aware he was owned, acted as our active saboteur, ensuring evidence was mishandled, surveillance was misdirected, and investigations hit dead ends. The beauty of the system was its redundancy. If one source was discovered, the others remained intact. If one provided false information to test loyalty, the others could verify. I knew more about the DEA and FBI operations in Atlanta than most of their supervisors. I knew which prosecutors were aggressive and which ones could be waited out through appeals. I knew which judges were strict and which ones could be forum shopped. The task force designed to destroy me had become my intelligence service. The money flowed through channels so complex that even forensic accountants would need years to untangle them. Payments never came directly from cartel accounts. Instead, they were disguised as consulting fees, real estate investments, business partnerships, and loan repayments through shell companies registered in Panama, Belize, and the British Virgin Islands. One agent received money through a construction company that hired him as a contractor for weekend security work that never actually happened. Another got payments disguised as investment returns from a technology startup that existed only on paper. The amounts were significant but not suspicious, 50,000 here, 75,000 there, always below the reporting thresholds that would trigger automatic scrutiny. Over 3 years, I paid approximately $2 million to compromise the Atlanta operation. In return, I moved an estimated $400 million worth of product to the East Coast with minimal law enforcement interference. The return on investment was extraordinary. The corrupted task force allowed me to expand operations with unprecedented security. My networks spread from Atlanta to Charlotte to Richmond to Philadelphia to New York, all while the primary task force investigating Mexican cartels was either chasing false leads or accidentally sabotaging their own operations. Distribution cells operated with confidence because they knew law enforcement moves in advance. When raids were planned, product was moved days earlier. When informants were recruited, they were identified and either turned or eliminated before they could provide significant intelligence. When wiretaps were authorized, conversations were adjusted to avoid incriminating content. The American justice system, with all its resources and technology, was being outmaneuvered by corruption so subtle that most investigators never suspected it existed. The few who did suspect found their concerns dismissed by the very people who were compromised. But nothing lasts forever, and the larger the corruption, the more difficult it becomes to maintain. The first crack appeared in late 2018 when a completely separate FBI unit investigating public corruption in Georgia stumbled onto financial irregularities involving one of my compromised agents. They weren't looking for cartel connections. They were investigating local political kickbacks, but the offshore accounts they discovered raised questions. The agent with the gambling problem began to panic. Panic makes people sloppy, and sloppy makes them dangerous. He reached out to my intermediary demanding more money for additional risks, threatening to confess if his needs weren't met. That was a mistake. In my organization, threats are not negotiable. We couldn't eliminate an American federal agent without bringing catastrophic attention, but we could isolate him and prepare for the possibility of his cooperation with investigators. My lawyers began building alternative explanations for money flows, and my intelligence network started monitoring his every movement. The second crack was more serious. The confidential informant having the affair with the agent began to feel guilty about her role. Guilt is dangerous in this business because it makes people irrational. She started talking to a priest, seeking absolution for betraying someone she loved. The priest, bound by confessional confidentiality, couldn't report what he heard, but he urged her to turn herself in. In summer 2019, she met with an FBI internal affairs investigator and provided a partial confession. She didn't reveal everything, protecting certain details to minimize her boyfriend's involvement, but she said enough to trigger an internal investigation. Within weeks, the task force began reviewing cases from the previous 3 years, looking for patterns of compromise operations. They found them. Operations that should have succeeded but failed. Intelligence that leaked before actions could be taken. Evidence that mysteriously became inadmissible. The Internal Affairs Unit realized they had a major corruption problem, but they didn't yet know how deep it went. I learned about the internal investigation within 48 hours of its initiation. The greedy agent, my most deeply compromised source, still had access to sensitive internal communications and reported the development immediately. At that point, I faced a strategic decision. I could order complete silence and hope the investigation couldn't prove anything, or I could begin dismantling the network proactively. I chose a third option. I would feed them a partial truth, sacrificing the most exposed agent to protect the larger operation. The gambling addict was already under financial scrutiny and showing signs of breaking under pressure. If he was going to confess anyway, it was better to control the narrative of his confession. Through my intermediaries, we provided him with an attorney who specialized in cooperating witnesses, someone we trusted to shape his story in ways that protected our remaining assets. The confession of the first agent in December 2019 was a controlled demolition. He admitted to accepting money in exchange for information, but claimed he was recruited by a criminal organization he couldn't identify through intermediaries he never met, for purposes he didn't fully understand. He portrayed himself as a victim of his own weakness, manipulated by sophisticated criminals who exploited his gambling debts. His testimony provided enough truth to satisfy investigators while obscuring the full scope of the corruption. He named no other agents, identifying only the intermediary who first approached him, a man who had already fled to Mexico and would never face American justice. The FBI treated it as a significant but isolated incident, exactly as I intended. They increased internal security protocols and reassigned task force members, but they didn't realize the infection ran deeper. The other 2 agents remained in place. Now even more valuable because investigators believed they had solved the problem. The investigation and prosecution of the gambling agent dominated the news cycle in Atlanta for months. Federal prosecutors celebrated it as evidence that internal corruption would not be tolerated. The agent received 8 years in federal prison, a sentence designed to send a message. The media covered it as a cautionary tale about personal weakness leading to professional compromise. But nobody asked the deeper questions. How had a Mexican cartel known to recruit this specific agent? What operations had been compromised during the years he was active? Were there others still embedded in the system? The investigation stopped where it should have begun, satisfying the public need for accountability while leaving the real infrastructure intact. My remaining sources continued providing intelligence, now with even greater security precautions. The close call had made everyone more careful, which ironically made the operation more sustainable. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, the corrupted network continued functioning, though at a reduced level. The agent whose girlfriend had been compromised requested a transfer to a different field office, which we encouraged, having a source in Washington, D.C. Was potentially more valuable than Atlanta, though the transition would take time. The greedy agent remained in Atlanta, now working with an intensity designed to erase any suspicion. He volunteered for additional assignments, worked longer hours, and became a model of dedication, all while continuing to provide me with intelligence about cartel operations across the Southeast. The investigation that had threatened everything had somehow made my remaining assets more deeply embedded and less suspicious. American law enforcement had convinced itself that the problem was solved, which meant they stopped looking for problems. But the truth has a weight that eventually becomes unbearable. By 2022, the agent who had appeared most secure, the greedy one who had played his role perfectly, began to unravel psychologically. He started drinking heavily, making mistakes in his personal life, showing signs of stress that colleagues noticed. The contradiction between his public role and his private betrayal was destroying him from inside. When Internal Affairs began a routine investigation into his use of force during an arrest, they discovered inconsistencies in his financial records. The offshore payments that had seemed so carefully concealed began to surface under serious scrutiny. By fall 2022, he knew he was facing the same fate as the first compromised agent. He could remain silent and eventually be prosecuted with overwhelming evidence, or he could cooperate and hope for leniency. He chose cooperation, but this time, there was no intermediary to control his confession. His testimony was devastating, not to my organization, but to the credibility of American federal law enforcement. He provided details about years of corruption, names of intermediaries, descriptions of how the network operated, and most damaging, evidence that the first agent's confession had been incomplete and possibly coordinated. He revealed the existence of other compromised sources, though he didn't know their specific identities. His confession forced the FBI to admit that the 2019 investigation had failed to uncover the full scope of cartel penetration. Congressional hearings were held. The Atlanta Task Force was completely dissolved and rebuilt with new personnel. Dozens of cases from 2016 to 2022 were reviewed for possible contamination. Several convictions were overturned. The scandal was massive, and I watched from Mexico with satisfaction, not because I had won, but because I had proven the point I always knew was true. Every system has a price, and the system they claimed was incorruptible had been mined for 6 years. The agents are in prison now, their lives destroyed by choices they made when they believed the money was worth the risk. The confidential informant who triggered the first investigation died in a car accident in Mexico in 2020, officially ruled accidental. The intermediaries who facilitated the payments are either dead or beyond the reach of American justice. The money itself, moved through so many layers of corporate shells and offshore accounts, has never been fully recovered. American prosecutors have indicted me for the corruption scheme, adding it to the dozens of other charges I already face, but I remain in Mexico where extradition is a political question, not a legal one. They offer rewards for information, they announce investigations, they promise justice, but the reality is simple. I am beyond their reach, and they know it. People will judge me, and they should. I am not a hero, not even to myself. I am a criminal who recognized that the war on drugs was never about morality or justice. It was about power, money, and control, and the people claiming to fight drugs were often as corrupted by those forces as the people selling them. I didn't create the system that allowed federal agents to be purchased. I simply recognized it existed and exploited it with the same ruthless efficiency I applied to every other aspect of my organization. The tragedy is not that I succeeded in buying the Atlanta Task Force. The tragedy is how easy it was, how willing they were, how little their oaths actually meant when confronted with money and pressure. I am a product of a broken system, not its cause. But this confession serves a purpose beyond ego or justification. It is a message to those who continue to fight this endless war with the delusion that their institutions are clean. They are not. Every major cartel in Mexico has learned the lessons I proved in Atlanta. Corruption is not an exception in the drug war. It is a strategy, a tool, a reality that both sides understand, but only one side admits. American law enforcement will rebuild their task forces, strengthen their internal affairs protocols, increase their oversight mechanisms, and claim they have learned from their failures. But as long as the drug trade generates billions of dollars annually, and as long as the people fighting it are human beings with weaknesses, mortgages, divorces, sick children, and dreams that government salaries cannot fulfill, the cycle will continue. The only question is who will be smart enough to recognize it and ruthless enough to exploit it. I am 53 years old now, living in hiding, running an organization that spans continents, wanted by governments on multiple continents, and fully aware that my life will end either in prison or in violence. But before that end comes, I wanted the truth told. Not the sanitized version in court documents or the dramatized version in narco series, but the real story of how I turned the hunters into the hunted, how I made the American justice system work for me instead of against me, and how Atlanta, Georgia became not a battleground in the drug war, but a conquered territory. They will eventually catch someone they claim is me, parade him in front of cameras, and declare victory. But the network I built, the lessons I taught, the corruption I exposed, those will outlive whatever fate awaits me. That is my legacy, and this is my confession. The war on drugs is a lie, and I proved it by buying the people who claim to fight it. Remember that when they tell you the next success story, the next big arrest, the next promise that this time will be different? It won't be, because the system itself is what needs to change, and neither side has the courage to admit it. What they don't tell you in the congressional hearings or the press conferences is that Atlanta was just the beginning, just a proof of concept. Once I demonstrated that a major federal task force could be compromised systematically, all organizations took notice. The Sinaloa Cartel, despite our conflicts in Mexico, studied what I had done and applied similar methodologies in Los Angeles and San Diego. The Gulf Cartel targeted Houston with renewed sophistication after learning from my successes and mistakes. Even smaller organizations in Colombia and Central America began viewing corruption not as opportunistic bribes, but as strategic infrastructure, requiring the same planning and resources as smuggling routes or money laundering operations. I had inadvertently created a blueprint that spread through the criminal underworld like a virus, and American law enforcement was unprepared for the evolution. They still thought of corruption as isolated incidents of weakness rather than coordinated campaigns designed to hollow out their institutions from within. The personal cost of these victories is something I think about in the hours before dawn when sleep won't come. I have 4 children, though I haven't seen 2 of them in years, because their mothers chose safety over my presence in their lives. I don't blame them. What father wants his children associated with the most wanted man in Mexico? My daughter Jessica was arrested in 2020 on money laundering charges, and while I had the resources to provide the best legal defense, I couldn't protect her from the choice she faced. Co-prate against me or face decades in prison. She chose prison, and that loyalty cuts deeper than any betrayal could. She's serving time in America for the crime of being my daughter, and I cannot even visit her or speak to her without risking both our safety. The empire I built has given me power over federal agents and billion-dollar drug corridors, but it couldn't give me dinner with my children or the chance to watch my grandchildren grow up. My wife lives in hiding, moving between safe houses, never staying anywhere long enough to establish roots or friendships. She didn't choose this life. She chose a young man who wanted to provide for his family, who worked as a police officer trying to make an honest living before the system showed him that honesty was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. Now she's the wife of Mexico's most wanted criminal, celebrated by some as a folk hero and despised by others as the architect of violence that has killed thousands. She tells me she doesn't regret the journey because it kept our family alive when poverty would have killed us, but I hear the lie in her voice. She regrets every day of it, every move, every loss, every moment of fear. She just loves me enough to pretend otherwise, and that might be the cruelest part of all. The Atlanta operation changed how I viewed the entire drug war because it proved what I had always suspected but never fully confirmed. The war isn't about stopping drugs. If it were, they would focus on demand reduction, treatment programs, and addressing the poverty and desperation that fuel both consumption and recruitment. Instead, they focus on supply interdiction, which is simply a market manipulation tool that keeps prices high and profits enormous. Every ton of cocaine seized makes the remaining product more valuable. Every cartel leader arrested creates opportunities for younger, more violent successors. Every corrupted agent represents a system so fundamentally broken that the corruption itself becomes part of the ecosystem. The American government spends $50 billion annually fighting a war they don't actually want to win, because winning would eliminate the justification for the budgets, the agencies, the careers, and the power structures built around the conflict. The agents I corrupted believed they were exceptions, that their personal circumstances justified what they knew was wrong, but they were simply honest about what the entire system does on a macro level. American foreign policy in Latin America has always prioritized control over justice, stability over democracy, cooperation over human rights. The DEA works with Mexican military units known to commit atrocities because they're effective against cartels, then expresses shock when those same units are later found on cartel payrolls. The CIA cooperated with traffickers during the Cold War when it served anti-communist objectives, then prosecuted similar cooperation when the political winds changed. The hypocrisy is structural, institutional, built into the foundation of how power operates. My corrupted agents were just applying the same moral flexibility on an individual level that their government applies internationally. After the Atlanta scandal broke completely in 2023, I watched American media try to explain how it happened as if it were some unprecedented aberration. They brought in experts who talked about improved vetting procedures, enhanced financial monitoring, and psychological evaluations to identify vulnerability to corruption. None of them addressed the fundamental issue that law enforcement officers are paid middle-class salaries to fight organizations that generate billions in revenue annually. A DEA agent makes roughly $80,000 a year. A successful mid-level cartel operator makes that in a week. The financial disparity isn't just a temptation, it's a structural impossibility. You cannot ask people to remain incorruptible when the economic incentives are so catastrophically imbalanced. Some will resist out of principle or fear or genuine commitment to justice. But many won't, and the system knows this, accepts this, and plans around this while publicly pretending to be shocked each time it's exposed. The methodology I developed in Atlanta has been adapted and applied in contexts I never imagined. I learned in 2023 that a Chinese fentanyl manufacturing network had used similar techniques to compromise inspectors at pharmaceutical companies and customs officials at ports. They had studied the CJNG playbook, recognized its effectiveness, and applied it to a completely different drug trade pipeline. That realization was sobering because it meant the problem was bigger than Mexican cartels or the drug war specifically. It was about the fundamental vulnerability of regulatory systems when confronted with unlimited resources and ruthless intelligence operations. Every industry with valuable contraband, from counterfeit goods to human trafficking to weapons smuggling, could potentially apply the same model. I had proven that institutional integrity was just a matter of finding the right price and the right pressure point. My organization has evolved beyond my direct control at this point. The CJNG operates in 35 Mexican states and exports to Asia, Europe, and Oceania, in addition to the United States. I cannot possibly oversee every operation, approve every strategy, or bet every alliance. I set the philosophy and establish the model, but the organization has become something larger than any single person. There are factions within the CJNG that I'm not certain I could control even if I wanted to. Groups that use our name and infrastructure but operate with their own objectives and methods. Some are more violent than I would prefer. Others are more reckless with civilian exposure. A few have tried to establish their own corruption networks without the sophistication or patience that made Atlanta successful, and their failures have attracted unnecessary attention. The empire I built is becoming something I no longer fully recognize, and that terrifies me more than any law enforcement operation. The isolation of this life is absolute in ways that civilians cannot comprehend. I am surrounded by guards, advisors, and operatives, but I trust none of them completely because trust is weakness in this world. Every conversation is potentially monitored. Every relationship is potentially compromised. Every moment is potentially the setup for betrayal or arrest. I have not walked on a public street in years. I have not eaten in a restaurant, attended a movie, or done any of the mundane activities that normal people take for granted. My world has contracted to safe houses, secure communications, and the constant calculation of threats and opportunities. The money and power that corrupted Atlanta's task force has purchased for me a life of paranoid confinement, where every pleasure is tainted by the awareness that it could be the moment when everything ends. There are nights when I allow myself to imagine what life would have been like if I had remained that honest police officer, struggled with poverty, raised my children in a small house in Michoacán, and died unknown. Would I have been happier? Almost certainly. Would I have been poorer? Obviously. Would my children be safer? Without question. But that path was closed to me the moment I saw my first paycheck barely covered groceries while cartel operators drove luxury vehicles and built mansions. The system created men like me by offering only two paths out of poverty: remain honest and struggle, or compromise and thrive. I chose survival over virtue, and once that choice is made, there is no going back. Every subsequent decision builds on the first, and eventually you look back and cannot recognize the person you were before you cross that initial line. The American agents I corrupted probably think similar thoughts in their prison cells. They remember being young, idealistic, genuinely committed to law enforcement, and wonder when exactly they became the criminals they once hunted. The gambling addict probably traces it back to the first bet he couldn't afford. The greedy one probably points to the first evidence room skim. The one with the compromised girlfriend probably identifies the moment he chose love over procedure. But the truth is more complex than single decisions or moments of weakness. They became corruptible because the system they served was already corrupted, because the war they fought was already a lie, because the institutions they represented prioritized image over integrity. I didn't corrupt them. I just exposed corruption that was already there, waiting for the right offer. What haunts me most is not the violence I have authorized or the lives destroyed by the drugs I moved. Those are terrible, and I will answer for them eventually, whether to human justice or something beyond. What haunts me is the knowledge that I have made the problem worse while claiming to expose it. By proving federal agents could be bought, I made every agent suspect. By demonstrating institutional vulnerability, I encouraged more attacks on institutions. By showing corruption at the highest levels, I fed cynicism that makes reform even harder. I wanted to prove the system was broken, but in doing so, I helped break it further. That is the paradox of this confession. It is both truth and poison, revelation and weapon, confession and corruption in itself. Telling this story serves my ego and my legacy, but it also damages the already fragile trust between citizens and the institutions meant to protect them. The younger generation of cartel operators looks at what I accomplished in Atlanta with admiration and ambition, seeing it as a model to replicate rather than a cautionary tale about what happens when moral boundaries disappear completely. They don't understand that success in this world is just delayed failure, that every victory contains the seeds of eventual destruction, that the more powerful you become, the more inevitable your fall becomes. They see the billions in revenue and the corrupted officials and the empire spanning continents. They don't see the loneliness, the paranoia, the knowledge that everyone around you wants something, the awareness that your children pay for your choices, the certainty that your ending will be violent or imprisoned. Atlanta made me legendary in criminal circles, but legends are stories told about the dead. The irony is that I spent years manipulating American law enforcement, buying their agents, subverting their operations, and proving their vulnerability. And yet the biggest threat to my continued freedom has nothing to do with American agencies. It comes from within Mexico, from rival cartels, from ambitious subordinates, from political changes in a government where I once had influence but can no longer control. The president who looked the other way during my rise has been replaced by one who faces international pressure to demonstrate action against cartels. Elements within Mexican military and police who previously accepted my bribes have been purged or reassigned. The protection I purchased domestically is eroding faster than my American corruption network did, and I cannot buy my way out of this problem because everyone knows I am already desperate. Desperation makes you weak, and weakness in this world is fatal. I began this confession by saying every empire has a price, but I never considered what the price would be for my own empire. I thought it was measured in money paid, risks taken, and strategies executed. But the real price is measured in lost time with family, in relationships poisoned by suspicion, in the man I might have been sacrificed to the man I became, in the knowledge that every success brought me closer to this moment of reckoning. The Atlanta operation was my masterpiece, the proof that I could outsmart, outmaneuver, and control even the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in the world. But that masterpiece has become my prison, the thing that makes me too dangerous to ignore, too visible to hide, too significant to simply disappear. I wanted to be remembered, to matter, to prove I was smarter than the system. I succeeded, and that success will be what destroys me. That is the price of empire. That is my final confession.